speaker who's been the governor of RBI and the chief economist and head of research, director of research at IMF. HashFuture is immensely proud to present one of the best brains in the world today, Mr. Raghuram Rajan.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this wonderful state and back to Kochi, where I had the occasion to look at some of the work that you've been doing here, which is very energizing, very hopeful for the future of India. What I want to talk to you about today in the time I have available is both the positives of the technological AI robotic revolution, some of which we see in the displays outside. There's a lot of promise, there's a lot of hope, there's a lot of anticipation as to what this will bring. And you've heard some of the speeches and the discussions of the last day and a half referred to all that. But there's also fear. And if you see what is happening in the world today, what is prominent, for example, in today's headlines are the tariffs that the US is thinking of levying on China. There's the possibility of a trade war going forward. And you might think this is unrelated to technology, but in fact, it is very closely related. And so, even as we see the promise of the future, the unbounded benefits that technology will bring, we have to think about two important things. One, how is this going to affect society, and how can society take best advantage of it? And more specifically, from the perspective of India, where are we in the scheme of things? And are we going to benefit from the future that you see outside these rooms today? So I want to walk you through some of the fears first. And this is not to diminish from all the benefits that are likely, but I want to talk about the fears a little bit and talk then about how the fears might be overstated, but then go to saying that even if those fears are overstated, we don't have time in India to sit and watch how things evolve. We have to move fast, and we have to move faster than we are moving today if we are to take the full benefits of a technologically enabled world. So, and then I will end, if I have time, with what are the things we could do. And you've seen a lot of that already in these sessions earlier. I will be repeating in some ways or amplifying in others. So let me start first with why is technology an issue? And clearly, it centers around not so much the benefits that technology brings. Of course, there are concerns about privacy and so on. But the fears largely are around jobs and job losses. Even in the industrial world, where education levels are much higher, there is a very strong fear that people will not have the incomes to benefit from all the bounty that technology offers. So we've already seen over the last 30 years or so a steady loss of jobs in jobs that are routine as well as unskilled. Those typically, the jobs that used to be, for example, in low-level assembly, those first went to countries that had low-cost labor and increasingly are being automated. Even routine skill jobs, as we saw from the discussions earlier, are also being replaced because it's very easy for a routine skill job to be done by a program or a machine, and whatever small parts of it cannot be done by machine, can be done by human, but essentially a lot of work disappears to the machine. And therefore, over the last 30 years or so, you see that what are left are non-routine skill jobs, that is the job of a consultant, a corporate manager, a lawyer, a doctor, an engineer, typically highly paying jobs, and non-routine unskilled jobs where the robots don't have the perception or the flexibility still today to replace humans at low cost. Of course, we have some examples of attempts at doing that outside, but still, the cheapest way to do this still today, for example, the job of a gardener or the job of a cook in a fast food restaurant, or even the job of a construction worker, still much of it is done by people rather than machines. But what this means is, across the industrial world, you have a hollowing of jobs at the middle. Jobs that either used to be skilled and routine, jobs done by clerks, jobs done by tellers at banks, or that used to be routine and unskilled, for example, in the large factories. And this hollowing out of middle-class jobs has been a very big factor in the kind of anxiety that you see in industrial countries today, which reflects in the votes that populist movements get, which reflects in the kind of anti-trade movements that we see today. Now, that was then, and it is true in every industrial country that the middle, jobs at the middle have disappeared, and jobs at the extreme, the higher income and the lower income jobs, have been what have remained. But what we hear now with the advances in machine learning, in artificial intelligence and robotics, is this is going to change still further, right? Even jobs that require perception and manipulation, that used to be immune to machines. For example, sewing garments. Sewing garments used to be very difficult for machines to do, which is why we still had a lot of sweatshops across the emerging markets doing this. Now, increasingly, machines can do that. They can feel cloth, they can rearrange cloth, they can do the stitching that used to be done by relatively unskilled workers, and used to be the first step out of agriculture into industry and into higher incomes. That first step of the ladder increasingly is threatened because machines are getting better. Similarly, in the National Health Service in the UK, just the other day, I saw a panelist representing the firm Babylon, which essentially has used enormous amounts of data to do medical diagnosis. And so today, what they're saying is they've captured 3% of patients on the National Health Service who prefer inputting their symptoms and having a conversation with a bot on the net, and thereby getting a quick diagnosis, rather than waiting 2 weeks for an actual doctor to have the time to see them. This is something that is happening even today, and that would suggest, at least if this carries on, that the job of a doctor may also be at risk. So remember I said highly skilled jobs were not at risk earlier. Now with artificial intelligence, of course, this is something that is becoming under threat. So what does that leave? What jobs will humans be able to do in the next 10, 15 years that are immune from threat? Well, clearly the jobs that require high intelligence and creativity, but of course not all of us can be Einsteins, right? So if that's the requirement, then many of us will not have jobs. Second set of jobs that will be required are jobs that require human empathy. Jobs in management, but as Mr. Matthews was saying, jobs in nursing, in healthcare, where having a human help you is quite important. And third, and this is somewhat unfortunate, we humans don't like to be waited on robots. We feel a greater sense of importance if we are waited on by people. So jobs where humans working for us bolster our status, such as jobs as doormen, butlers, waiters, those are still going to be there for some time, so long as human society requires that. So where does that leave the average person, human being? Where does that leave, for example, a professor like myself? Am I going to be out of a job soon? And clearly the answer is yes, that to some extent, we are moving, you've seen the talk of MOOCs earlier. These are classes that can be taught by superstar professors, so you don't need the ordinary professor to teach the class. The problem with MOOCs so far is the dropout rate has been huge. Maybe 8 or 10% of the average people who sign up for a MOOC actually finish it. And that suggests that having a teacher who looks at you and asks you to do your homework and is disappointed if you don't do your homework is probably part of the teaching experience and the learning experience. And if you don't have that, you're quite willing to cheat on a robot and not submit your homework. So if that's the case, then some combination of the MOOC, as well as local teaching assistants who hold your hand, do your grading or talk to you about your grades, who monitor your performance, and who look disappointed when you haven't done well, that may well be the combination that works in producing high-quality teaching as well as the kind of monitoring that actual teachers do to essentially transmit good education across the globe. Well, where does that leave the average professor? Well, it does mean that teaching becomes less and less part of the average professor's job because less qualified people can do the hand-holding because, after all, they're just there to support the superstar teacher. But for the professor, that leaves the creative research and writing, frees them up to do much more, and that's where they're going to essentially be focused on. So what this would suggest is across every job, there's going to be a restructuring, taking away the routine aspects and leaving the creative and the customized aspects of that job, which often might mean much less work, but which often also might mean a requirement of much greater capability to do the exception handling that such kind of work requires. So that's the source of the fear, that many of us will not have jobs, and some of us will have jobs that require skills that we don't yet have, or we will have to acquire. Is the world going to get there soon? There's a fear, but is that fear justified? And this is where I think it's quite easy to say history suggests no. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, there has been fear of man being replaced by machines. If you remember, the early Luddites broke machines in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution because they didn't want their jobs taken away. Well, their jobs did disappear, but 200 years after the Industrial Revolution, the unemployment rate in the United States today is 4.1%. In other words, there's basically no unemployment. People do have jobs, even though machines have got much smarter. And the point, I think, from this is that people adapt, society adapts, jobs adapt to do the things that the machines cannot do, and in a sense, we have human-augmented machines doing the jobs, or machine-augmented humans doing the jobs, and that is a more powerful combination than machines alone or humans alone. The question is how to make that possible, and it is not without the need for adaptation. Humans do have to adapt, and we have to figure out how to make it easy for humans across the globe to do the adaptation. Now, one place where the fears are reflected is that every time there is fear that man is going to be replaced by machine, there is a fear of where incomes will come from. And the natural answer always is we have to have a universal basic income. The universal basic income, I've looked for historical antecedents, and I can trace it back to the 1960s, when Lyndon Johnson set up a committee in the United States to look at what would happen when humans would be replaced by robots, which was coming soon. Remember, this is in the 1960s, around 60 to 70 years ago, 60 years ago. What that committee finally proposed is that the United States should move towards a universal basic income. This was in the 1960s. We're still debating universal basic income because we still think in the next 10 or 15 years we won't have jobs. But in truth, society thus far has always found ways to adapt, even if there's always a claim by technologists that this time is going to be different. Okay? So that's a source for hope. And let me add one last reason for hope, which is that there's always a huge amount of hype associated with technology. And there's some underlying capability transformation which happens, and it happens steadily. But we always think the future is going to come faster than it comes. And one example of this is, the concept of artificial general intelligence, AGI, which is some program or algorithm which is as smart as humans, right? That is the goal. That is the nirvana, to some extent, of AI research programs. Well, since the 1950s, scientists and experts have always been thinking AGI is coming. It always is coming 15 years from now. If you look at expert predictions since the 1950s, it's always been coming 15 years from now. Even today, when is AGI going to come? Some people say we don't know. Somebody like Ray Kurzweil will say 2027. But in general, it is 15 years from now. In other words, we always believe it's coming, but it's always coming in the future, right? So that gives you some reason to hope that the fear of job losses is probably overstated, partly because of hype, but partly other reasons that make technology slower to evolve or allow society to adapt to technological change more quickly. For example, organizations are conservative. I'll come to each of these. Organizations are conservative and people are conservative. So we change as a society slower than the technologists want us to change. Third, there's a value to human interface that we often, people who are used to dealing with machines, forget that our fathers, our grandmothers aren't used to doing that, and that value to human interface preserves jobs longer than we think. Fourth, in economics, if a good is produced more cheaply, its price goes down, which means demand goes up. And often what you see is in goods that can be produced far more effectively with machines, demand goes up so that the overall demand for human services associated with that may not necessarily fall. And I'll give you an example there. Fifth, we all often forget that the most flexible machine known to man is man himself or herself. There is nothing more flexible than the human. And so to that extent, the human thus far has adapted and often has proven very useful even when machines change. And the last, and probably the most worrisome aspect of why we don't change fast enough is politics, some of which we're seeing now. So let me just quickly go through these and then turn to India. So why do we not advance faster or proceed to lose jobs quickly, as the data certainly seems to suggest? One, of course, is that we overblow the benefits or the speed of adaptation of technology. Often we undertake experiments in very controlled conditions early on, see success, and immediately extrapolate to the much more complicated real world that we have. One example, of course, that we see today, unfortunately, is driverless cars, where the first incident of death immediately raises a lot of questions of, have we been pushing too fast, too quickly? No doubt driverless cars will come, but they will have to reassure people that, in fact, they are safe, and that will take a longer time than we think. Certainly, they will have to engage in the crowded streets of Daryaganj to be able to show that, in fact, they work. And if they can do it there, then clearly they can work anywhere. But that will take some time from now, when a driverless car, as you know, just killed somebody who was stepping onto the street. Another example of this excessive and quick confidence is quantum computing. Quantum computing is an extraordinary technology, but needs extremely stable conditions. And we are extrapolating very quickly from this the enormous benefits, but of course it'll take time for those conditions to be obtained more generally and for quantum computing to be widely accessible. So these are examples of technologies that are coming, will eventually show up, but perhaps they're being overblown at this point. The second aspect is conservative organizations and people. I have to say that one of my signal experiences in India was that in the Indian government, we still work with physical files, right? In the age of computer technology, we still work with physical files, and in fact, I was told the thicker the file, the less you need to read it, because it's been around so many times. But that's what we're working with, a conservative organization whereby the noting on the file and the numbering of the pages gives some security, some verification that you have seen it and this was your comment on it. Now, obviously all that can be replicated through technology, but getting the officers of the various administrative services to accept that is a long haul. Even at the RBI, when we move towards electronic documents, we have a 2-year program to actually run pilots first to see whether people are comfortable before we eventually move there. So the point is, organizations are conservative. That suggests technology takes time. Third, there's a value to human interface, right? One of the examples that we see out here, for example, is medical technology. But sometimes the underlying data and acquiring it is probably the most difficult. Getting data on what the ailments of a person are when the person themselves aren't willing to talk about that. I had a doctor friend, a discussion with a doctor friend who's a great medical doctor. And one of the patients he described was a patient who had some symptoms, and he went through it and just couldn't get what the underlying factor was. And then he asked the lady, how many drinks do you have a week? And she responded, maybe one drink a week. But the way she responded, he got the sense that it was more. And then he walked through the symptoms and then understood there was more to it than she was revealing. Now, if you just saw that data on a self-assessed diagnosis, you may not get at the underlying sort of diagnosis properly. This is something that doctors, with their sense of what humans are about, have a feeling. That is not to say these new technologies cannot work. They can work in many cases, but there are exceptions. And that's where the doctor comes, which then suggests that because of this, perhaps it's better to think of humans augmenting the machine. The machine does the basic analysis and then pushes up what it can't understand for the human to take a look and puts at the grasp of the human. This is what IBM's Watson does, all the relevant literature that might relate to this particular diagnosis that it has come up with, and therefore you get a doctor plus plus. Not only do you get a doctor plus plus, but the doctor can now see 20 patients because 20 of them have been pre-analyzed by the machine instead of seeing those 5 patients that the doctor used to see earlier, right? So that brings me to the fourth point, which is price and demand. If this is the case, that we can do far more better with higher quality, then the price for medical services will fall. But clearly, there's almost infinite demand for medical services today. Used to be in India, you could see a doctor, have a doctor come to your house. My guess is very few of you have that experience today. You have to go to a crowded clinic where the doctor gives you 1 minute or 2 minutes of their time. The demand for doctors in India is huge. Think of a force multiplier if we could multiply them 20 times. And that's what machines offer. That is why, to my mind, we will essentially not necessarily have doctor redundancy for a long time. In fact, we will have a whole new set of technicians whose job is to prepare the patient for the doctor, doing that machine-based analysis initially with the patient. The fifth point is human flexibility. That is, humans are cheaply and easily programmed to do things, which takes much more time for a robot to do. And this is why so many jobs still remain in the realm of the human. Machines are costly, even with all the advances, and the flexible, easily programmed robot is still some way away. But the last reason why things slow down is a bad reason, and that's the reason we're facing more and more today, which is politics. That is, any change hurts the people, the incumbents, and those incumbents strike back. For example, the Uber is something that hits at the taxi drivers, and across industrial countries, there are protests by taxi drivers against Uber. This is similarly with driverless cars. There will be concerns after this incident. If you remember, early on in the development of the motor car, there was an incident. Somebody was killed. And then there was a law that cars had to be preceded by somebody walking at not more than 4 kilometers per hour, because that was to flag the advent of the car. This was also true of the locomotive. And obviously, that eliminates all the advantage that the car or the locomotive have over the pedestrian or the horse-drawn carriage. Fortunately, good sense prevailed after some time, and they removed this requirement. But this is the point, that these kinds of efforts will come up. And today, the mood against trade often is really a disguised move against technology. You can't proceed against technology, but you can proceed against trade. Ultimately, the cause is the loss of jobs and the belief that we will get those jobs back by staying in the way. So let me end by coming to India. Now, even though what I've argued is the pace of change will probably be slower than we think, we cannot be complacent, because unlike the West, we don't have those jobs yet. We don't have any jobs to lose because we haven't got those jobs in the first place. We need far more jobs. So even as we improve infrastructure and logistics through the massive investments that are envisaged, we have to recognize that the export-led growth path is closing quickly, partly as a result of political movements in the West to build tariff walls, partly because technology is allowing them to bring back the jobs into their country through customized machine-based programs utilizing less labor. We need to join global supply chains sooner rather than later so that we have positions there that we can defend. Second, so first problem is we're not as global as we should be even now. Second, a well-known problem that we heard some discussion about, too many of our people are too poorly educated or skilled to compete in a globalized economy. And that's a globalized technology-enabled economy. And the fear is that if we don't remedy that quickly, we are on our way to something a banker friend once told me about, a two-tier economy of haves sitting in gated communities, being serviced by the have-nots, a vast population of drivers, servants, and others who are servicing the haves. That is not a economy which is socially stable and which is desirable in any sense of the word in the longer term. And the last threat that one has to worry about is that we lose out domestically on the technological revolution, and we find that our technology is essentially occupied by a whole host of foreign platforms, but with no domestic presence there. These are some of the fears if we don't act quickly. So we need to act. We've already heard we need a revolution in education and skill building. We have to recognize and remedy weaknesses in education at every stage, and we have a number. We need to build more world-class higher educational institutions domestically. We have a few, we need far more. And we also need to bring the talent that we have. One of the things we're very good at exporting is people. Well, let's get some of those people back to populate those institutions because we need better capabilities, and those people can help us and often are willing if we do the right actions to bring them back. We need to build out our transport, power, and logistics infrastructure quickly so that we still have a chance of participating in export-led growth. I think it's important to do that quickly. It's important not to say I'm focused on exports, but it's important to say I'm going to create the possibilities of export as well as the possibilities of servicing domestic demand. Now, one of the interesting things I have noticed in both these is that we have a huge hunger for capabilities at every level. You see it in the villages as the relatively poor villager sends their kid to an English medium school because they think that will get them a leg up. At the RBI, I was always gladdened to see the children of our what are called Class 4 employees. These children were often kids who had gone to the IITs, to tech college, Commerce College, held banks as gazetted, held jobs as gazetted officers in banks and so on. What that suggests is if we can create incomes at some level, the aspirations of people ensure that their children will move up even more significantly. And we have to focus on that building, on that capability building, and we can certainly do that. In terms of more mundane stuff, I think we also need to keep a relatively focused tariff regime so that we can participate in global supply chains. Sometimes increasing tariffs makes it harder to participate in those chains because goods move in and out of countries. You can't have a better advisor in Kerala than Geeta Gopinath, who's a world expert on these issues, but it's important that we listen to people who talk about how we can create a better position in the global trading system. We have to embrace technology and competition, but also we need to have a debate about key aspects of that process, such as data ownership. Who owns the data? And should the data be owned abroad, or can it be owned domestically by the individual? How can we make that happen? There's a lot of interesting technology out there in the stalls which talks about how you can own your own data, and I think we should spend a lot of time thinking about it. I certainly think we should call Nandan to devise a new structure on the data issues that will be on par with what he has done on the stack. Finally, I think the government has a lot to do. Not so much in intervening at the micro level. Of course, the success of the IT industry, to some extent, was because we didn't intervene at the micro level and we let the IT industry flourish. But we need to do what is necessary for Indian industry to flourish. And that means create easy paths to incorporation, create easy paths to funding. One of the big lacunae in this country is risk financing. And so our corporations our startups go and incorporate in Singapore because they need risk financing, which is not available in this country. And often our successful IT entities, our successful banks, are owned not by India, but by entities abroad, because we don't have enough risk capital in this country. I'm not saying we should prohibit the foreigners, they're providing a vital service, but we should make sure that Indian capital is there, because often it's closest to the ground and understands the financing better. We have to work on providing that capital much more easily. We certainly have to make sure more of our companies of the future incorporate in India, get Indian financing, and expand significantly. We cannot miss out on the AI and the robotics revolution. We have to embrace it. So bottom line, and my time is up, the world is changing very fast. We cannot oppose change, and we should not. But we need not be a victim of that change. We can embrace that change and participate fully on our terms. So we need to do what we've been doing faster and better. We have to be leaders rather than followers. Let me end by saying, when I was young, I had to leave the country to see the world. Tomorrow, the world will be coming to India, and we will not have to leave to see it. But what this conference suggests, and what we see every day when we look at the world around, is we have to prepare, for the world is coming. Thank you very much.